Viking raids petrified their enemies. The morning mist clung to the river like a shroud, and through it came death itself, silent as serpents, swift as wolves. The monastery bells that should have rung for morning prayers instead tolled in terror, their bronze voices crying out a warning that came too late. By the time the monks saw the dragon heads emerging from the fog, by the time they glimpsed the painted shields and gleaming axes, their fate was already sealed. This was how it began, always, with the mist and the silence, and then the screaming. The year was 793, and on the holy island of Lindisfarne, something unthinkable was happening. Men from the north, pagans who knew neither Christ nor mercy, were desecrating one of Christianity's most sacred sites. They moved through the monastery like a plague, taking what they wished, killing those who resisted, enslaving those who surrendered. The survivors would later speak of demons risen from the sea, of warriors who fought with the fury of beasts and the cunning of men, of a darkness that had descended upon their world that would not lift for centuries to come. But Lindisfarne was only the beginning. What followed was an age of terror that would reshape the medieval world, an epic written in blood and ash across the pages of history. The Vikings had arrived, and with them came a new kind of warfare, a new kind of fear that would burrow deep into the collective consciousness of Europe and refuse to leave. To understand why Viking raids petrified their enemies, one must first understand that these were not merely military campaigns. They were psychological warfare perfected, a symphony of terror orchestrated by masters of fear who understood that the greatest victories are won in the mind before a single sword is drawn. The monks who survived that first raid at Lindisfarne spoke of eyes like ice, of men who laughed as they killed, who seemed to take pleasure in the destruction of all that was holy. But what truly terrified them was the efficiency of it all. These were not mindless barbarians driven by bloodlust alone. They were calculating predators who had studied their prey, who knew exactly when to strike and where to hit hardest. They came when defenses were weakest, when guards were few, when the faithful were at prayer and their minds turned to heaven rather than the earthly danger approaching on the tide. Consider the medieval mind, shaped by centuries of Christian teaching, protected by the certainty that God watched over the faithful and that holy places were inviolate. The Viking raids shattered this worldview as thoroughly as their axes shattered skulls. If God would not protect his own houses, if prayers could not turn aside pagan blades, then what safety existed anywhere in this world? The psychological impact was devastating. Entire communities fell into despair, convinced that the end times had come, that these northern demons were harbingers of the apocalypse itself. The Vikings understood fear as a weapon more potent than any sword. They cultivated their fearsome reputation with the care of gardeners tending prize roses. Their ships, those magnificent dragons of the sea, were designed not just for speed and shallow drafts, but for psychological impact. The dragon heads that adorned their prows were carved to inspire terror, painted in colors that seemed to glow with malevolent life. When a Viking fleet appeared on the horizon, it was as if the monsters of legend had broken free from the realm of nightmare and entered the waking world. Their appearance, too, was carefully crafted for maximum psychological effect. The Vikings bleached their beards with lye, making them appear almost supernatural in their pallor. They wore their hair long, often braided in complex patterns that spoke of a culture both sophisticated and savage. Their weapons were not merely functional, but beautiful in their lethality, decorated with intricate patterns that caught the light and drew the eye, even as they dealt death. Some warriors wore masks in battle, transforming themselves into living embodiments of fear, becoming the monsters their enemies already believed them to be. But perhaps most terrifying of all was their unpredictability. The Vikings followed no Christian calendar, observed no holy days when warfare was forbidden. They could appear anywhere, at any time, striking from the sea or following rivers deep into territories that had considered themselves safe from maritime assault. A monastery that had stood unmolested for centuries could be reduced to smoking ruins in a single morning. A town that had thrived for generations could find itself emptied of life between one sunset and the next. The speed of Viking attacks was legendary and contributed greatly to the terror they inspired. Their longships, those marvels of medieval engineering, could travel up rivers that larger vessels could not navigate. They could beach on almost any shore, disgorging warriors who moved with the coordination of a single organism. A Viking raid was like a lightning strike, sudden, devastating, and over before effective resistance could be organized. By the time local militias could be mustered, by the time word could be sent to distant lords, the Vikings had already vanished back into the mist, leaving only destruction in their wake. This hit-and-run strategy was not born of cowardice, but of brilliant tactical thinking. The Vikings understood that their strength lay not in holding territory, but in the taking of it. They were not interested in conquest in the traditional sense, at least not in the early centuries of their raiding. They wanted wealth, slaves, and the spread of their reputation. Each successful raid made the next one easier, as fear preceded them like an advance guard, weakening resistance before they even arrived. The choice of targets, too, showed a ruthless intelligence that terrified medieval observers. Monasteries were favored not just because they were wealthy and poorly defended, but because attacking them sent a message that reverberated throughout Christendom. If the Vikings did not fear God's wrath, if they would willingly desecrate holy ground and murder those who had devoted their lives to prayer, then they were either supremely confident in their own gods or utterly godless. Either possibility was terrifying to a world that defined itself through faith. Markets and trading centers were also prime targets, chosen for maximum economic impact. The Vikings understood that disrupting trade routes could cripple a region more effectively than burning a dozen villages. They targeted bridges, mills, and other infrastructure that communities depended upon. They were not simply raiders, but economic terrorists who understood that fear could be transmitted through commerce as effectively as through violence. The taking of slaves was another aspect of Viking raids that spread terror throughout medieval Europe. Unlike many slave-taking cultures, the Vikings showed no preference for any particular type of person. Men, women, children, nobles, peasants, clergy. All were equally likely to find themselves chained in the hold of a longship, bound for slave markets in Dublin, York, or distant Constantinople. The randomness of it added to the terror. No one was safe. No status offered protection. No age was too young or too old. Entire families could be torn apart in minutes, never to see each other again. The Vikings were also masters of psychological manipulation on an individual level. They understood that a terrified enemy is a defeated enemy, and they used every tool at their disposal to inspire fear. The Berserkers, those legendary warriors who fought in a trance-like fury, were perhaps the most feared of all Viking fighters. Whether their battle rage was induced by mushrooms, alcohol, or psychological conditioning remains debated, but its effect on their enemies was undeniable. To face a berserker was to face madness incarnate, a warrior who felt no pain, knew no fear, and fought with a strength that seemed superhuman. The practice of the blood eagle, whether real or legendary, became a symbol of Viking cruelty that haunted the medieval imagination. The ritual, which supposedly involved cutting open a victim's back, breaking the ribs, and pulling out the lungs to form wings, was said to be reserved for the most hated enemies. Whether it was ever actually performed matters less than the fact that people believed it was. The mere possibility that one might suffer such a fate was enough to make strong men weak with fear. Viking weapons themselves became objects of terror. The Danish axe, with its broad blade and long handle, could split a man from crown to groin with a single blow. Viking swords, often given names and passed down through generations, were believed to thirst for blood like living things. The sight of these weapons, gleaming in the hands of warriors who wielded them with casual expertise, was enough to break the morale of hastily assembled defenders. But the Vikings were not simply brutes who relied on fear and violence alone. They were also master negotiators who understood when to use the carrot as well as the stick. The practice of demanding danegeld, tribute paid to prevent raids, was a form of psychological warfare, as insidious as any physical attack. Communities that paid were admitting their weakness, acknowledging Viking supremacy, and worse, they were funding future raids against their neighbors. The system created a web of complicity and fear that weakened collective resistance. The religious dimension of Viking raids added another layer of terror for their Christian victims. The Vikings worshipped gods of war and chaos, deities who rewarded violence and praised those who died with sword in hand. To Christians raised on teachings of peace and martyrdom, this warrior religion was both fascinating and horrifying. The Vikings fought not just for gold, but for glory in the eyes of their gods, and this religious fervor made them fearless in battle. The concept of Valhalla, where warriors who died bravely would feast and fight for eternity, meant that Vikings often seemed to welcome death in battle. This apparent eagerness to die was deeply unsettling to Christian opponents, who, while they believed in heaven, generally preferred to delay their arrival there as long as possible. Fighting an enemy who viewed death as a reward rather than a punishment required a complete recalibration of military thinking. Viking raids also exploited the political fragmentation of medieval Europe with ruthless efficiency. They understood that Christian kingdoms were often at odds with each other, that local lords might be more interested in weakening their rivals than in presenting a united front against pagan invaders. The Vikings made alliances when it suited them, played factions against each other, and often found Christian lords willing to hire them as mercenaries against other Christians. This political manipulation extended to the church itself. The Vikings quickly learned that different monasteries and bishoprics were often in competition for resources and influence. They exploited these divisions, sometimes sparing one religious house while destroying another, creating a climate of uncertainty where no one knew who might be next. This unpredictability was itself a form of torture. keeping entire regions in a constant state of anxiety. The seasonal nature of Viking raids added to their psychological impact. The sailing season, roughly from spring to autumn, became a time of dread for coastal and riverine communities, the first sight of spring flowers, which should have brought joy, instead brought fear. Summer, the season of growth and abundance, became the season of watching the horizon for dragon-headed ships. Autumn harvests, the reward for a year's hard work, became prime targets for raiders who knew exactly when communities would be at their most vulnerable and valuable. This seasonal terror created a cycle of fear that shaped entire lifestyles. Communities moved away from coasts and rivers, abandoning fertile lands for the relative safety of less accessible areas. Trade routes were altered, markets were relocated, and entire economic systems were reshaped by the Viking threat. The cost in lost productivity and abandoned resources was incalculable, a form of economic warfare that continued even when no Vikings were present. The Vikings also understood the power of reputation and actively cultivated their fearsome image. Skalds, the poet-historians of the Viking world, composed verses celebrating the most brutal raids and the most feared warriors. These poems, spreading through the Viking world and beyond, served as a form of propaganda that enhanced the psychological impact of future raids. When a Viking fleet arrived at a new target, their reputation had often arrived before them, carried by traders, travelers, and terrified refugees. The practice of leaving survivors to spread word of Viking brutality was a calculated strategy. Total annihilation might have been more thorough, but it would have limited the spread of fear. By allowing some to escape, by ensuring that there were witnesses to carry tales of horror to neighboring communities, the Vikings multiplied the psychological impact of each raid exponentially. One successful attack could terrorize an entire region without the Vikings having to visit each settlement personally. The adaptability of Viking tactics was another source of terror. Just when communities thought they had developed effective defenses, the Vikings would change their approach. They used different types of ships for different missions, from the classic longship to smaller, more maneuverable vessels for river raids. They adopted new weapons and tactics from their enemies, combining them with their traditional methods to create an ever-evolving threat. When coastal communities built better defenses, the Vikings simply moved further inland, following rivers that defenders had never thought to fortify. When towns built walls, the Vikings learned siege warfare. When communities hired mercenaries to protect them, the Vikings often simply outbid them, turning protectors into accomplices. This constant adaptation meant that no defense was ever permanent, no safety ever assured. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of the Vikings were sophisticated and frightening. They maintained networks of informants throughout Europe, often through trading connections. Viking merchants, indistinguishable from any other traders, would visit markets and towns, noting defenses, counting guards, assessing wealth. When the raiders came months later, they knew exactly where to strike and what they would find. This intelligence network extended to political and religious information. The Vikings knew when important councils were being held, when bishops were traveling, when treasuries were likely to be full. They understood the Christian calendar and knew when communities would be distracted by religious observances. This level of preparation made their raids seem almost supernatural in their timing and precision. The treatment of captives during Viking raids was calculated to inspire maximum terror. While some were killed outright, and others taken as slaves. The Vikings also practiced more subtle forms of psychological warfare. Important captives might be mutilated and released, living warnings of what happened to those who resisted. The practice of cutting off noses, ears, or hands created a population of visible victims who served as constant reminders of Viking power. Ransom was another tool in the Viking arsenal of terror. The practice of capturing important individuals and demanding payment for their release created agonizing dilemmas for communities. Pay the ransom and fund future raids, or refuse and bear responsibility for the death of a loved one or leader. The Vikings were skilled at setting ransoms just high enough to be painful, but not so high as to be impossible, maximizing both profit and psychological impact. The use of fire as a weapon added a primal terror to Viking raids. The sight of a burning monastery or town created a spectacle visible for miles, a pillar of smoke by day and a glow by night that announced Viking presence to entire regions. Fire was indiscriminate, consuming not just buildings, but centuries of accumulated culture, irreplaceable manuscripts, artworks, and relics. The smell of smoke became associated with Viking attacks, creating panic even when the fires had other causes. The Vikings also understood the psychological value of seemingly irrational violence. While much of their brutality served practical purposes, they would sometimes engage in acts of destruction that appeared to have no material benefit, killing livestock that they could not take with them, destroying crops they could not harvest, poisoning wells they would never use again. These acts sent a clear message that Viking raids were not just about profit, but about power, about demonstrating their ability to destroy for destruction's sake. The corruption of local populations was another insidious aspect of Viking psychological warfare. They would often spare those who cooperated, creating a class of collaborators who profited from betraying their own communities. This practice destroyed social cohesion and created an atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal. No one could be certain that their neighbor was not secretly in league with the Vikings, ready to open gates or reveal hidden treasures for a share of the spoils. The impact on religious faith was profound and lasting. Many Christians struggled to understand why God would allow such devastation to be visited upon the faithful. Some saw the Vikings as divine punishment for sin, leading to waves of religious extremism and self-flagellation. Others lost faith entirely, converting to paganism or simply abandoning religious practice. The Vikings had not just attacked bodies and buildings, but the very spiritual foundation of medieval society. The Vikings were also masters of timing their raids for maximum psychological impact. They would often attack during important festivals or holy days, not just because defenses might be relaxed, but because the contrast between celebration and slaughter was so devastating. A wedding turned into a funeral, a harvest festival into a massacre. These juxtapositions created traumatic memories that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. The practice of leaving calling cards after raids was another form of psychological warfare. Vikings would sometimes arrange corpses in horrifying displays, leave runic messages carved into church doors, or perform ritual desecrations that made it clear this was not random violence, but targeted terror. These signatures meant that even after the Vikings had departed, their presence lingered, a ghostly reminder that they could return at any time. The economic terrorism practiced by the Vikings extended beyond simple theft. They understood that fear itself had economic value. Merchants would pay protection money to ensure safe passage. Towns would offer tribute to be spared. The mere rumor of Viking presence could shut down trade routes and empty markets. The Vikings had created an economy of fear where their reputation was as valuable as any plunder. The sophistication of Viking navigation added to their terrifying mystique. Their ability to appear from the open ocean, to navigate in conditions that kept other sailors in port, to find their way through fog and storm, seemed almost magical to their victims. The Vikings could strike from directions that seemed impossible, appearing where no ships should be able to go, reinforcing their supernatural reputation. The role of women in Viking society also contributed to the terror they inspired. The idea that Viking women were as fierce as their men, that they would sometimes accompany raids and participate in the violence, was deeply disturbing to medieval Christian sensibilities. The shield maidens, whether real or mythical, represented a complete inversion of proper gender roles, another way in which the Vikings violated every norm of civilized behavior. The Viking practice of oath-breaking was particularly terrifying to a society built on bonds of loyalty and honor. The Vikings would make treaties when it suited them, and break them just as readily. They would accept baptism to seal an alliance, and return to paganism the moment they were out of sight. This flexibility with regard to oaths and religious conversion made them utterly unpredictable and untrustworthy in the eyes of their enemies. The long-term psychological effects of Viking raids shaped European civilization in profound ways. The constant threat of attack led to the militarization of society, the rise of the castle, the development of knight culture. The Vikings had created a world where violence was always imminent, where peace was at best a temporary respite between storms. This perpetual state of warfare readiness changed the medieval mindset permanently. The memory of Viking raids persisted long after the raids themselves had ended. Parents would frighten children with tales of northern demons. Place names recorded ancient traumas. Folk songs preserved memories of specific attacks. The Vikings had burned themselves into the collective memory of Europe, becoming bogeymen that haunted the medieval imagination for centuries. The transformation of Vikings from raiders to rulers added a new dimension of fear. When men like Rollo established themselves as lords in Normandy, when the Danelaw was carved out of England, when Viking dynasties took thrones in Ireland and Scotland, it demonstrated that the raiders were not just destroyers, but potential conquerors. The fear of a raid was replaced by the fear of permanent subjugation. The religious conversions of Viking leaders created complex psychological responses. When raiders who had burned churches began building them, when men who had slaughtered priests became patrons of monasteries, it created a cognitive dissonance that was deeply unsettling. Were these conversions genuine, or were the Vikings simply adapting their tactics, conquering through faith what they had failed to take by force? The intermarriage between Vikings and local population created another form of anxiety. The blood of the raiders was mixing with that of their victims, creating a new generation that carried both heritages. Children grew up torn between cultures, living reminders of the complex relationship between conqueror and conquered. The fear of the other was complicated by the recognition that the other was becoming part of the self. The literary legacy of Viking raids reveals the depth of their psychological impact. Chronicles written centuries after the fact still convey visceral terror. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle speaks of the Vikings in terms usually reserved for natural disasters or divine punishment. Irish annalists recorded Viking attacks with a mixture of factual detail and emotional horror that makes the fear palpable even today. The architectural response to Viking raids permanently altered the European landscape. Churches were fortified, becoming as much fortresses as houses of worship. Towns were rebuilt with defense as the primary consideration. The Vikings had forced a continent to reshape itself in response to their threat, creating a physical legacy of fear carved in stone and earthwork. The development of early warning systems showed how deeply Viking raids had traumatized coastal communities. Networks of beacons, watchtowers, and riders were established to provide advance notice of approaching ships. The resources devoted to these systems, maintained even during years when no Vikings appeared, demonstrated the persistent psychological impact of the raids. The influence on military technology and tactics was profound. The Vikings forced European armies to adapt or perish. Mobile defense forces were created to respond quickly to raids. Weapons and armor were modified to counter Viking fighting styles. Naval technology advanced rapidly as kingdoms sought to match Viking mobility. The raiders had become inadvertent teachers, forcing military evolution through terror. The impact on law and governance was equally significant. New laws were created specifically to deal with Viking threats. Systems of collective defense were established. The concept of the militia was refined and expanded. The Vikings had forced a reconstruction of social organization, creating new bonds and obligations born from shared fear. The psychological warfare techniques pioneered by the Vikings influenced military thinking for centuries. The use of terror as a strategic weapon, the cultivation of fearsome reputation, the exploitation of psychological weaknesses, all became standard elements of warfare. The Vikings had written a textbook on fear that future conquerors would study and apply. The economic structures created in response to Viking raids had lasting effects. The need to pay denegeld led to new forms of taxation. The disruption of trade routes forced the development of alternatives. The concentration of wealth in fortified centers changed patterns of commerce. The Vikings had reshaped the medieval economy through fear as much as through direct action. The influence on literature and storytelling was immense. The Vikings became stock villains in countless tales, their characteristics exaggerated and mythologized with each retelling. They entered the realm of legend, becoming more terrifying in memory than they had perhaps been in reality. The psychological impact of their raids was thus perpetuated and amplified through narrative. The religious responses to Viking raids shaped Christian theology and practice. The concept of holy war, the idea of fighting pagans as a religious duty, was strengthened by the Viking threat. New saints emerged from victims of Viking violence. Prayers specifically against Viking attack entered the liturgy. The raiders had forced Christianity to become more militant in its own defense. The development of national identities was accelerated by the Viking threat. Nothing unites disparate groups like a common enemy, and the Vikings served this purpose across Europe. English, French, Irish, and other national consciousnesses were partly forged in opposition to Viking raids. Fear created solidarity where none had existed before. The transformation of the Vikings themselves over time added layers to the psychological impact of their legacy. As they settled and assimilated, as they became Christians and Europeans, they demonstrated the fluid nature of identity. Yesterday's raiders became today's neighbors. Yesterday's enemies became today's rulers. This transformation was both reassuring and disturbing, suggesting that civilization itself was more fragile than anyone had imagined. The study of place names reveals the geographical extent of Viking psychological impact. From Ireland to Russia, from Scotland to Sicily, locations bear witness to Viking presence. These names, spoken daily by people who might not even know their origin, carry forward the memory of fear. The Vikings had inscribed themselves on the very landscape of Europe. The influence on art and iconography was significant. Viking motifs entered European decorative traditions, their dragon ships and intricate metalwork inspiring both admiration and unease. The aesthetic of violence that the Vikings embodied influenced depictions of warfare and warriors. They had changed not just what Europeans feared, but how they visualized fear itself. The medical knowledge gained from treating victims of Viking raids advanced European understanding of trauma. Physical wounds required new surgical techniques. Psychological trauma demanded new forms of healing. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to medical progress through the injuries they inflicted. The diplomatic innovations required to deal with Vikings shaped international relations. New forms of treaty-making, new concepts of international law, new methods of negotiation, all emerged from the crucible of Viking encounters. The raiders had forced Europe to develop more sophisticated ways of managing conflict and creating peace. The linguistic impact of Viking raids extended beyond borrowed words. The need to communicate with raiders and settlers led to pidgin languages and accelerated linguistic change. Old English was transformed by Old Norse. French incorporated Nordic elements. The Vikings had changed how Europe spoke, as well as how it thought. The technological exchanges that occurred despite the violence had lasting effects. Viking shipbuilding techniques influenced European naval architecture. Their metalworking skills were adopted and adapted, even in terror. Knowledge was transmitted, creating a complex legacy of fear mixed with inadvertent progress. The cartographic advances, driven by the need to track and predict Viking movements, improved European understanding of geography. Maps became military necessities, coastal charts essential for defense. The Vikings had forced Europe to know itself better, to chart its vulnerabilities and strengths with unprecedented accuracy. The influence on concepts of masculinity and warrior culture was profound. The Viking ideal of the warrior, fearless and fierce, became both a model to emulate and a nightmare to fear. European military aristocracies adopted aspects of Viking warrior culture even as they fought against it. The raiders had redefined what it meant to be a fighting man. The economic innovations required to fund defense against Vikings led to new financial instruments. Early forms of insurance emerged to protect against raid losses. Credit systems developed to allow rapid movement of funds for ransom or tribute. The Vikings had inadvertently stimulated financial innovation through the economic chaos they created. The architectural techniques developed to resist Viking attacks influenced building for centuries. The science of fortification advanced rapidly. Construction methods that could withstand fire became standard. The Vikings had taught Europe to build with defense always in mind, creating a landscape of paranoia carved in stone. The influence on legal concepts of property and ownership was significant. Viking raids forced clarification of inheritance laws, property rights, and compensation systems. Legal codes were refined to deal with the disruptions caused by raids. The Vikings had forced Europe to think more carefully about possession and loss. The psychological techniques developed to cope with Viking terror laid groundwork for understanding trauma. Religious communities developed practices to deal with the aftermath of raids. Secular authorities created support systems for displaced populations. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to the development of what would much later be recognized as disaster psychology. The intelligence and espionage networks created to monitor Viking threats became models for later state intelligence services. The need to track Viking movements, to have advance warning of raids, to understand their intentions, led to sophisticated information-gathering systems. The Vikings had forced Europe to become better at watching and understanding potential threats. The influence on military logistics was substantial. The need to respond quickly to Viking raids required pre-positioned supplies, rapid deployment systems, and efficient command structures. The Vikings had taught Europe that mobility and speed were as important as strength in warfare. The development of new weapons, specifically to counter Viking tactics, advanced military technology. Crossbows were refined to penetrate Viking shields. Cavalry tactics were developed to pursue raiders. Siege weapons were adapted for rapid deployment. The Vikings had driven an arms race that accelerated military innovation. The psychological impact on children who grew up during the Viking Age shaped a generation. These children, raised with constant fear, developed different attitudes toward violence, security, and community. They built the castles and fortified towns of the High Middle Ages, creating a world shaped by childhood trauma. The influence on concepts of time and seasonality was notable. The Viking raiding season imposed its rhythm on European life. Spring became a time of dread, autumn a season of relief. The Vikings had changed how people experienced the passage of time itself, infusing natural cycles with artificial terror. The development of new forms of communication to warn of Viking attacks advanced European infrastructure. Signal systems, messenger networks, and early warning protocols created connections between previously isolated communities. The Vikings had inadvertently fostered European integration through shared fear. The impact on gender relations within European society was complex. The need for all members of society to contribute to defense changed traditional roles. Women took on new responsibilities when men were killed or captured. The Vikings had disrupted gender norms not just through their own shield maidens, but through the social changes their raids necessitated. The influence on agricultural practices was significant. The need to hide or quickly harvest crops before Viking raids led to new farming techniques. Storage methods improved to protect food supplies. Agricultural calendars were adjusted to minimize vulnerability. The Vikings had changed how Europe fed itself. The psychological preparation for death that Viking raids necessitated influenced religious and philosophical thought. The constant possibility of sudden violent death forced contemplation of mortality. New theological frameworks emerged to explain suffering and provide comfort. The Vikings had deepened European engagement with existential questions. The development of refugee support systems in response to Viking displacements created new social institutions. Churches and monasteries developed procedures for caring for those fleeing raids. Secular authorities created policies for resettlement. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to the development of humanitarian response systems. The influence on education was notable. The destruction of monastic libraries by Vikings led to new methods of preserving and duplicating texts. Educational systems were decentralized to prevent total loss. The Vikings had forced Europe to think more carefully about knowledge preservation and transmission. The impact on trade guild organization was significant. Merchants banded together for mutual protection against Viking raids. New forms of commercial association emerged. Insurance and risk-sharing arrangements were developed. The Vikings had accelerated the development of commercial institutions. The psychological impact of Viking ship technology created lasting maritime anxieties. The sight of any unfamiliar sail on the horizon could trigger panic. Coastal communities developed elaborate protocols for identifying approaching vessels. The Vikings had made the sea itself a source of terror. The influence on diplomatic protocol was substantial. The need to negotiate with Vikings led to new forms of international engagement. Translation services were developed. Diplomatic immunity concepts were refined. The Vikings had forced Europe to develop more sophisticated diplomatic tools. The development of new forms of historical record-keeping was driven by Viking raids. The need to document losses, track patterns, and preserve memory led to improved chronicle writing. More systematic record-keeping emerged. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to the development of historical methodology. The psychological impact on concepts of home and belonging was profound. Viking raids created displaced populations who had to redefine identity and community. New forms of social bonding emerged among refugees. The Vikings had forced Europe to think more deeply about what constituted home and community. The influence on military recruitment and training was significant. The need for rapid response to Viking raids led to new models of military service. Training methods were developed to prepare troops for Viking tactics. The Vikings had professionalized European military forces through necessity. The development of new economic models to cope with Viking disruption, advanced financial thinking, concepts of risk assessment, resource allocation under uncertainty, and economic resilience emerged. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to economic theory through the chaos they created. The psychological techniques developed by survivors to cope with trauma laid groundwork for understanding resilience. Communities that survived repeated raids developed cultural practices that promoted recovery. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to human understanding of psychological survival. The influence on concepts of justice and revenge shaped legal philosophy. Viking raids created cycles of retaliation that forced deeper thinking about justice. New frameworks for limiting vengeance were developed. The Vikings had complicated European understanding of crime and punishment. The impact on technological diffusion was significant, despite the violence. Viking raids brought different cultures into contact, spreading innovations even through conflict. Technologies moved along raid routes in unexpected ways. The Vikings had accelerated cultural exchange through terror. The development of new forms of collective memory to preserve the experience of Viking raids influenced cultural practices. Songs, stories, and rituals emerged to process trauma. Annual commemorations were established. The Vikings had shaped how Europe remembered and processed collective suffering. The psychological impact on concepts of divine justice and theodicy was profound. Viking raids forced theological reconsideration of suffering and divine will. New explanations for evil emerged. The Vikings had deepened European theological sophistication through the questions their violence raised. The influence on military intelligence gathering advanced espionage techniques. The need to penetrate Viking planning led to new methods of information collection. Spy networks were established. Code systems were developed. The Vikings had professionalized European intelligence services. The development of new architectural techniques for rapid fortification, advanced engineering. Temporary defenses that could be erected quickly were designed. Modular fortification systems emerged. The Vikings had driven innovation in defensive architecture through the unpredictability of their attacks. The psychological impact on concepts of civilization and barbarism was lasting. Viking raids forced Europeans to define more clearly what distinguished civilized from uncivilized behavior. New cultural boundaries were drawn. The Vikings had sharpened European self-definition through contrast. The influence on medical treatment of psychological trauma advanced healing practices. Religious communities developed early forms of counseling for raid survivors. Secular authorities created support systems. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to the development of trauma treatment. The development of new forms of community organization for mutual defense strengthened social bonds. Voluntary associations for protection emerged. New concepts of civic duty developed. The Vikings had fostered European communal solidarity through shared threat. The psychological techniques of intimidation perfected by Vikings influenced later military practice. The cultivation of fearsome reputation. The use of symbolic violence. The manipulation of enemy psychology all became standard military tools. The Vikings had written an enduring manual on psychological warfare. The impact on concepts of property rights and inheritance was complex. Viking raids created situations requiring new legal frameworks. Questions of ownership after displacement were addressed. The Vikings had advanced property law through the disruptions they caused. The influence on the development of standing armies was significant. The need for professional soldiers, always ready to respond to raids, changed military organization. Permanent forces replaced seasonal levies. The Vikings had professionalized European warfare through the demands of defense. The psychological impact on religious practice led to new forms of spiritual expression. Prayers for protection became central to liturgy. New saints emerged from Viking victims. The Vikings had influenced Christian practice through the fear they inspired. The development of new trading practices to minimize Viking predation. Advanced commercial techniques. Hidden trade routes were established. Coded commercial communications emerged. The Vikings had driven innovation in commercial security. The influence on concepts of heroism and sacrifice shaped cultural values. Stories of resistance to Vikings created new hero archetypes. Martyrdom in defense of the community gained new meaning. The Vikings had influenced European concepts of noble death. The psychological techniques developed to maintain morale under Viking threat advanced leadership practices. New forms of inspirational communication emerged. Methods of maintaining hope despite terror were developed. The Vikings had contributed to leadership theory through the challenges they posed. The impact on demographic patterns was lasting. Populations moved in response to Viking threats, creating new settlement patterns. Previously, marginal lands were populated by refugees. The Vikings had redrawn the demographic map of Europe. The influence on the development of naval warfare was profound. European powers were forced to create navies capable of matching Viking mobility. New ship designs emerged. Naval tactics were revolutionized. The Vikings had transformed European naval capability through competitive pressure. The psychological impact on concepts of the sacred and profane was significant. Viking willingness to desecrate holy places forced reconsideration of sacred space. New theological understandings emerged. The Vikings had complicated European religious thought through their sacrilege. The development of new forms of economic resilience to survive Viking predation, advanced financial practice, distributed wealth storage emerged. Risk mitigation strategies were developed. The Vikings had taught Europe about economic survival under threat. The influence on the evolution of European languages through stress and contact was notable. Rapid linguistic changes occurred in areas under Viking threat. New vocabularies for fear and resistance emerged. The Vikings had accelerated linguistic evolution through trauma. The psychological techniques of recovery, developed by communities that survived Viking raids, laid foundations for resilience theory. Cultural practices that promoted healing emerged. Community rituals for processing trauma were established. The Vikings had inadvertently contributed to understanding of collective recovery. As the sun sets on this exploration of Viking terror, we return to where we began, with the mist and the silence that preceded the storm. The Vikings did more than raid and plunder. They fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of medieval Europe. They introduced a new form of warfare that targeted minds as much as walls, that understood fear as a weapon more potent than any blade. Their legacy persists not just in the fortified churches and abandoned settlements that dot the European landscape, but in the collective memory of a civilization that learned to live with terror as a constant companion. The Vikings taught Europe that safety was an illusion, that faith alone could not turn aside violence, that the sea, which had brought trade and connection, could also bring death and destruction. They forced a continent to confront its vulnerabilities, to acknowledge that the walls between civilization and chaos were thinner than anyone had imagined. In doing so, they inadvertently strengthened the very societies they terrorized, forcing adaptation, innovation, and unity in the face of existential threat. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Viking raids was the demonstration that terror itself could be a strategic tool, carefully cultivated and deliberately deployed. The Vikings showed that warfare was not just about territory or treasure, but about dominance over the human psyche. They proved that a relatively small number of determined warriors, armed with superior mobility and utter ruthlessness, could hold entire civilizations hostage to fear. The monks of Lindisfarne, watching their world burn on that terrible morning in 793, could not have imagined that they were witnessing the beginning of an age that would reshape Europe. They saw only destruction, only the ending of everything they held dear. But from that destruction would emerge new forms of resilience, new understandings of community and defense, new philosophies for comprehending a world where such horrors were possible. The Viking Age ended, not with a decisive battle or a signed treaty, but with a gradual transformation. The raiders became rulers, the pagans became Christians, the destroyers became builders, but the fear they had sown took much longer to fade. Generations of Europeans grew up with grandparents who remembered the terror, who passed down stories of dragon ships and burning churches, of warriors who laughed as they killed and seemed to feel no human emotion save the joy of destruction. This generational trauma shaped the medieval world in ways both obvious and subtle. It influenced architecture and urban planning, military organization and diplomatic practice, religious thought and popular culture. The Vikings had carved their mark not just on the physical landscape, but on the European psyche itself, creating scars that would take centuries to heal. The question of why Viking raids petrified their enemies ultimately has a simple answer. They understood that fear was more powerful than any army. They cultivated terror with the same care that farmers cultivated crops, nurturing it, spreading it, harvesting its benefits. They turned psychological warfare into an art form, demonstrating that the most effective conquests were those that took place in the mind before a single blow was struck. In the end, the Vikings left a dual legacy. They were destroyers who inadvertently became creators, terrorists who forced their victims to become stronger, pagans who helped shape the future of Christian Europe. They showed that civilization was both more fragile and more resilient than anyone had realized, that it could be shattered by determined violence, but could also adapt and endure. The mist has cleared now, and the dragon ships have long since rotted away. But on quiet mornings, in certain lights, in the half-remembered stories passed down through generations, the terror remains. It whispers in the stone of fortified churches, echoes in the names of places where battles were fought and communities destroyed, lives on in the collective memory of a continent that once learned to fear the northern wind. The Vikings achieved a form of immortality through fear. Long after their gods were forgotten, long after their language fell silent, long after their kingdoms crumbled, the memory of their terror endured. They had discovered the dark truth that fear, once properly sown, never truly dies. It passes from generation to generation, weakening, perhaps, but never disappearing entirely. A ghost that haunts the halls of history. And so we close this chronicle of terror with the understanding that the Vikings' greatest weapon was never their axes or their ships, but their mastery of human psychology. They intuited what modern military theorists would later codify, that victory belongs not to the strongest, but to those who best understand and exploit the fears of their enemies in their brutal way. They were pioneers of psychological warfare, teachers of a terrible lesson that resonates through history. The medieval world that emerged from the crucible of Viking terror was harder, more militarized, more suspicious than what had come before. But it was also more unified, more innovative, more aware of its own strengths and weaknesses. The Vikings had been the storm that tested the foundations of European civilization, and while much was destroyed in that testing, what survived was stronger for having endured. In the final analysis, the story of why Viking raids petrified their enemies is a story about the power of fear itself. It demonstrates how terror can be weaponized, how reputation can be more valuable than reality, how psychological dominance can achieve what physical force alone cannot. The Vikings understood these truths intuitively and exploited them brilliantly, creating a legacy of fear that outlasted their civilization by centuries. The morning mist rises again, as it has every day since that first raid at Lindisfarne. But now it carries no dragon ships, no painted shields, no laughing warriors intent on destruction. It is just mist, harmless and ephemeral. Yet, for those who know the history, who understand what once emerged from such mists, there remains a faint echo of ancient terror. The Vikings are gone, but the fear they perfected lives on, a reminder that human psychology remains our greatest vulnerability, and that those who understand how to exploit it hold a power more devastating than any weapon. Thus ends our exploration of Viking terror, a journey through one of history's darkest chapters. We have seen how a relatively small population from the northern margins of Europe managed to terrorize a continent, not through numbers or superior technology, but through their mastery of fear. They showed that terror, properly applied, could bring kingdoms to their knees and reshape civilizations. It was a lesson written in blood and ash across the pages of medieval history, a lesson that echoes still in our understanding of warfare and human nature. The Vikings have passed into legend now, their historical reality often obscured by myth and romanticism. But for those who lived through their raids, who saw their communities destroyed and their certainties shattered, they were all too real. They were the darkness that came with the dawn, the death that arrived on the tide, the fear that walked on two legs and carried an axe. They were, in short, the most successful terrorists of the medieval world, and their success lay not in what they destroyed, but in the fear they created, a fear so profound that it changed the course of European history, and perhaps that is their most enduring legacy, the demonstration that fear itself can be a force of historical change. The Vikings showed that terror, deliberately cultivated and strategically deployed, could achieve what armies alone could not. They proved that the human mind, for all its rationality and faith, remained vulnerable to the primitive fear of violent death. They exploited this vulnerability with a ruthlessness that shocked even a violent age, creating a template for psychological warfare that would influence military thinking for centuries to come. The bells of Lindisfarne are silent now, have been silent for more than 1,000 years, but in the silence, we can still hear the echo of that first terrible morning when the Vikings announced their presence to the world. We can still feel the shock that ran through medieval Europe as community after community fell to the northern raiders. We can still sense the fear that gripped entire populations, the terror that reshaped a civilization. This, then, is why Viking raids petrified their enemies, not because they were invincible in battle, not because their gods were stronger, not because their weapons were superior. They petrified their enemies because they understood that the greatest victories are won in the mind. That fear is more powerful than any army. That terror, properly applied, can achieve what force alone cannot. They were masters of psychological warfare in an age that had no name for it, practitioners of a dark art that turned human nature against itself. The Viking Age has ended, but the lessons they taught about fear and power remain relevant. In every age, there are those who understand that terror can be a tool, that fear can be weaponized, that the human psyche remains vulnerable to those who know how to exploit it. The Vikings were perhaps the first to perfect this understanding, to turn it into a systematic approach to warfare. They showed the world that battles could be won before they were fought, that reputations could be more valuable than armies, that fear could conquer where swords could not. And so we leave the Vikings where we found them, in the mist and the memory, in the terror they created and the changes they wrought. They were raiders and traders, explorers and settlers, pagans and eventually Christians. But above all, they were masters of fear, architects of terror, practitioners of a psychological warfare so effective that it changed the course of history. Their ships have rotted, their swords have rusted, their gods have been forgotten, but the fear they created lives on, a dark legacy that reminds us of the terrible power of terror and the vulnerability of the human mind to those who understand how to exploit it. The story of Viking terror is ultimately a story about human nature itself, about our capacity for violence and our vulnerability to fear. It shows how a small group of determined individuals, armed with mobility and ruthlessness, can hold entire civilizations hostage. It demonstrates that the most effective weapons are often not physical, but psychological, that the greatest conquests take place not on battlefields, but in minds. The Vikings understood these truths and used them to carve out a place in history, written in the blood and terror of their victims. As we close this long meditation on Viking terror, we are left with questions that echo across the centuries. What is it about human nature that makes us so vulnerable to fear? How can relatively small groups of violent individuals create such disproportionate terror? What does it say about civilization that it can be so easily shaken by those who reject its values? These are questions that the Viking Age poses but does not answer. Questions that remain relevant in every age that must confront the reality of terror. The Vikings have become part of our cultural mythology now, often romanticized and misunderstood, but for those who lived through their raids, there was nothing romantic about them. They were harbingers of death, dealers in terror, masters of a kind of warfare that targeted the soul as much as the body. They left scars on the medieval world that took generations to heal, created traumas that echoed through centuries, introduced a form of conflict that civilization had to learn to defend against or perish. In the end, the Vikings' greatest achievement was not the wealth they plundered or the territories they conquered, but the fear they created. They showed that terror could be a strategic asset, that psychological dominance could achieve what physical force could not, that the human mind remained vulnerable to those who understood its weaknesses. They were teachers of a dark lesson that history has not forgotten, a lesson about the power of fear and the fragility of the civilizations we build to keep it at bay. The dragon ships are gone now. The raiders have become farmers and merchants. The old gods have given way to the white Christ. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between certainty and doubt, the terror remains. It lives on in the collective memory of Europe, in the stories passed down through generations, in the understanding that civilization is always only one raid away from chaos. The Vikings taught this lesson with axe and fire, wrote it in blood across the continent, ensured that it would never be forgotten. And perhaps that is their true legacy, not the kingdoms they founded or the trade routes they established, but the demonstration that fear itself could be a historical force. They showed that terror, properly cultivated and deployed, could reshape civilizations, could force evolution and adaptation, could leave marks that would last for millennia. They were pioneers of a kind of warfare that attacked the mind before the body, that understood victory as psychological dominance rather than mere physical conquest. The bells ring again now in the restored churches, calling the faithful to prayer in lands once terrorized by pagan raiders. But those who know their history hear in those bells an echo of older alarms, of warnings that came too late, of communities that discovered too late that their walls were no defense against those who had mastered the art of fear. The Vikings are gone, but the terror they perfected remains a part of our understanding of human conflict, a dark knowledge that once learned can never be entirely forgotten. Thus concludes our journey through the age of Viking terror, a journey that has taken us from burning monasteries to fortified cities, from traumatized communities to transformed civilizations. We have seen how fear can be weaponized, how terror can achieve what armies cannot, how the human psyche remains vulnerable to those who understand its weaknesses. The Vikings were masters of this dark art, and their mastery changed the world in ways that still echo today. The mist clears one final time, revealing a Europe forever changed by the experience of Viking terror, stronger in some ways, wounded in others, bearing scars that would never fully heal, but having learned lessons that would never be forgotten. The Vikings had been the storm that tested the foundations of medieval civilization, and while the storm eventually passed, the memory of its fury would shape European consciousness for centuries to come. In teaching the world to fear them, The Vikings achieved a kind of dark immortality, living not in Valhalla, but in the nightmares of the descendants of their victims, a lasting testament to the terrible power of fear in human history.